I don't need help. I've done these 6 floors alone for 22 years, and I'll do them tonight.
The old man had one shaking hand on the rail and one on a tearing sack, and he hadn't managed the first step. Behind him, 6 flights climbed into the dark. The whole building had watched this old man climb alone all winter and decided it wasn't theirs to carry.
That bag isn't going to make it. It's already tearing.
The bag is fine.
The bag's in 2 pieces. That's usually how you can tell.
I said I don't need help. I can carry my own groceries. I've been doing it since before you were born.
I know you have. I've watched you climb this alone all winter. Isaac crouched and caught the oranges before they could roll. That's the hard part to watch. Then look somewhere else. Nobody asked you to stop. Nobody asked them to walk past you either. They still did. The old man had no answer for that, and the silence said more than his voice had. 6 floors, he warned at last, like it was a threat or a confession. So we take them slow. You set the pace, I carry the bag. They don't get shorter. I've counted every step for 22 years. No, they don't get shorter, Isaac said, but they get easier with 2. The old man glared at him. Late 70s, thin as a coat rack, a face like a closed door, and eyes doing something the closed door plainly didn't want them to. I'm on the 2nd floor, Isaac added. I'll carry them as far as they're going, and that's all it is. Isaac gathered the rest. A dented can of soup, a boxed loaf of bread, and 1 bright bag of orange marshmallow candy. The children's kind, with a cartoon on the front. That's not for me, the old man said, quickly, defensive, before Isaac could so much as glance at it. The candy. It's not. Leave it out of your judging. It's not for me. I didn't say a word, Isaac said gently, and cradled it against his chest with the rest. The old man looked at him a long moment, weighing something Isaac couldn't see. Then he turned and started up the stairs without another word, which, Isaac would learn, was as close to thank you as the man had left in him. Neither of them asked the other's name that night. Neither of them asked it any of the nights after, all that long winter. And by spring, a name would be the one thing each of them would have given anything to have. You don't need a person's name to carry them. Isaac would spend a whole winter proving it, for a man he knew nothing about at all. He just didn't know yet what the not knowing would end up costing him. Isaac Foley was 26, and he had come to the city 14 months ago with 2 duffel bags and no plan, which was about how long it had been since his grandfather died. His grandfather had raised him. Not his parents. They'd been a story Isaac didn't tell. But his grandfather, a slow, steady man who'd taught him to fish and to fix a carburetor and to keep his word, and who had, one Tuesday in the fall, sat down in his chair after supper and simply not gotten up again. Isaac had found him. He'd been the one to find him, and there are things about being the one to find someone that don't leave. And Isaac had packed 2 bags and gone to the city because staying in that house was like living inside a held breath. He worked the overnight shift at a small grocery, stocking shelves from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, which suited him because the work was quiet and the customers were few, and nobody at 3 a.m. wanted to know how you were really doing. He rented a single room on the 2nd floor of a 6-story walk-up on a street that never quite got warm. He knew no one. He'd made it that way on purpose. You can't lose people you never let yourself have. He had noticed the old man before that first night, of course. You couldn't not notice him. Every Saturday, the same slow procession, the old man crossing the lobby with his grocery sack and stopping at the foot of the stairs to gather himself the way you gather yourself before something hard. He'd take the first flight, then stand on the landing with one hand on the rail, breathing. Then the next. It took him 20 minutes to climb what took Isaac 90 seconds. And he did it every week, alone, because there was no one to do it for him. And the whole building had watched him do it. And the whole building had let him. Isaac hadn't planned to be the one who stopped. It had just been very cold that night. And the bag had been tearing, and his grandfather had raised him a certain way, and his hands had moved before the rest of him could talk them out of it. The old man lived on the 6th floor, in 6B, at the end of a hallway that smelled of other people's dinners. He unlocked 3 separate locks, and pushed the door open and stood in it, blocking the way, so Isaac understood he was not being invited in. Set them there. The old man pointed to a small table just inside the door. That's fine. That's far enough. Isaac set the groceries down. He could see past the man into a small, clean, spare apartment. A single armchair, a television, a wall of framed photographs he couldn't make out, and on the kitchen counter, visible from the door, a row of unopened bags of the orange marshmallow candy, 6 or 7 of them, lined up like they were waiting for something. He didn't ask. He'd already learned that much about the man in one flight of stairs. "Thank you," the old man said, in the stiff way of someone who hasn't had much practice lately. "You didn't have to." "I know. Good night." "You're really on the second floor?" 2C, a year now. Huh. The old man frowned, as if a person living in his own building for a year without his noticing was a small personal failure. I don't see many people." "That's all right. I don't either." And something in the way Isaac said it, not sad, just true, made the old man look at him again. The second real look of the night. And then the door of 6B closed, 3 locks turning, and Isaac went back down the 6 flights to his single room and did not know he'd just started something that would take both of them the rest of the winter and change the shape of 2 families. The next Saturday, Isaac was in the lobby at 7, checking his mail, when the old man came in with his sack. He told himself it was a coincidence. It wasn't. He'd been down at 7 the week before too, and he'd remembered, and some part of him had wanted to be there. He didn't examine that part very closely. "Evening," Isaac said. The old man stopped. "You're down here again. Getting my mail?" "You got mail every Saturday at 7? Apparently, Isaac nodded at the sack. "That one looks like it's holding. You want a hand anyway?" The old man's jaw worked. Pride is a physical thing in some people. You can watch it fight. "I can carry my own groceries." "I know you can. I watched you do it for a year." "That's kind of the problem." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means a man shouldn't have to do the hard thing alone just to prove he still can." Isaac shrugged. "I'm going up. You can hand me the bag, or you can watch me walk next to you carrying nothing, which is going to feel stupid for both of us." The old man looked at him for a long moment, then he held out the sack. 6 floors, he warned. "I know where you live," Isaac said, and started up. They climbed together after that, not talking much, the first few weeks, the old man setting the pace, stopping at each landing, Isaac stopping with him, carrying the bag and saying nothing about the stopping. It was on the 4th landing, some Saturday in December, that the old man finally spoke first. "You don't ask questions," he said. "Most people ask questions. You don't seem like you want any asked." "I don't, so I don't ask them." The old man nodded slowly, and they went up the last 2 flights, and that was the most either of them had said, and it felt, to both of them, like a great deal. The talking came in small pieces after that, always on the stairs, always between breaths. "You work," the old man said one week, on the 2nd landing. "Nights, I hear you leave." "Grocery store. I stock the shelves from 10 to 6. Nights are for the ones who don't sleep good." "That obvious? Takes one to know one." The old man started up again. "I haven't slept a full night in 22 years. You get used to it." 22 years is oddly specific," Isaac said. "Everything's specific if you count it. Watch that top step. The tread's loose." Another week, on the 4th landing, the old man asked, "Where's your people?" "Don't have any. Not anymore." "Everybody's got somebody." "I had my grandfather. He raised me." Isaac kept his eyes on the stairs. "He's the somebody I don't have anymore." The old man didn't say he was sorry. He just stood a moment longer on the landing than his lungs required, which was its own kind of thing. And then he said, "Grandfathers, that's a hard one to lose. You don't get another." "No," Isaac said. "You don't. Grab that bag a little higher. The bottom's going." And they climbed. Here is what Isaac didn't tell the old man, that whole winter, because the old man didn't ask. That every Saturday, climbing those 6 flights with a stranger's groceries, Isaac was carrying his grandfather up the stairs. He couldn't have said it out loud without it sounding foolish. But it was true. His grandfather at the end had gone up the stairs of his own house slow, one hand on the rail, stopping to breathe, exactly the way the old man did. And Isaac had been too young and too busy and too sure there was time to ever once offer his arm. He'd bounded up those stairs past his grandfather 1,000 times. "Come on, slowpoke." And then his grandfather had sat down in a chair one Tuesday, and there were no more stairs to climb with him, ever. And Isaac had spent 14 months wishing he could have one of them back. Just one, just to go slow. He couldn't have that, but he could carry a different old man's soup up a different 6 flights. Slowly. matching his pace, not saying a word about the stopping. It wasn't the same, but it was the closest thing the world had left him. And it was the reason a young man who'd built his whole life around needing no one showed up in a cold lobby every Saturday at 7 o'clock, like it was church. The old man never knew that. The old man just thought the boy was kind, which he was. But kindness, Isaac had learned, is very often just grief that has found somewhere useful to go. And here is what the old man didn't tell Isaac, because Isaac didn't ask. His name was Stanley Vogel, and he had a daughter, and he had not spoken to her in 22 years. The candy on the counter was hers. Orange marshmallow, the children's kind. She'd loved it when she was a girl, would have eaten nothing else if her mother had allowed it, and Stanley had bought a bag of it every single week for 22 years and never opened one. He couldn't have told you exactly why. Grief does things that don't survive being explained. He bought it the way some men visit a grave. It was the one small motion he let himself make toward a family he had, with his own 2 hands and his own hard mouth, thrown away. His wife, Irene, he'd called her, had died 22 years ago in the kitchen of that very apartment, on an ordinary afternoon. She'd said her chest felt tight. She'd said it twice. And Stanley, who was reading the paper, who did not want it to be anything, who had a lifetime's habit of not wanting things to be anything, had told her to sit down. She was making a fuss. She'd be fine. He'd waited too long, the length of a few pages of newsprint, the length of the rest of his life. And by the time he understood and called for help, it was already over, and Iris was gone from the kitchen floor of the only home they'd ever shared. Their daughter, Helen, had come. Of course she'd come, and Stanley Vogel, standing in the wreckage of the worst thing that would ever happen to him, drowning, looking for anywhere in the world to put a grief too big to hold, had looked at his daughter and said the thing that ended them. "She was asking for you," he'd said, "at the end, and you weren't here. You're never here." It wasn't true. Helen had a life 2 towns over, a husband, a job. She'd visited a week before. There was nothing she could have done. But Stanley had needed it to be someone's fault that wasn't his. Because if it was his fault, if the truth was that he'd sat in that chair and read the paper while his wife died 6 feet away, asking him to call, then he could not go on living, and so he had handed the weight of it to his daughter and closed the door. And then he'd been too proud and too ashamed for 22 years to open it again. Helen had tried. That was the part the building didn't know. The part that made the whole street's easy judgment of her a lie. She'd written. For years she'd written. Birthdays, holidays, then just letters, then just cards, then just her return address on an empty envelope so he'd know she was still out there if he ever wanted to reach. He'd sent them back unopened. She'd called. He'd hung up. She'd driven the 40 minutes and climbed the 6 flights. Because the elevator was broken, even then, some things don't change. And knocked on the door of 6B. And stood in that dinner-smelling hallway, and heard him on the other side, not moving, not breathing, waiting for her to leave. She'd had a son eventually, Ollie. Stanley had a grandson he had never met, 8 years old now, who knew his grandfather only as a photograph his mother kept in her wallet and sometimes looked at when she thought no one saw. Helen had stopped writing 3 years ago. Not because she'd stopped loving him, because there is only so long a person can keep knocking on a door that never opens before the knocking starts to break something in them that they need for the rest of their life. She'd told herself she was done. She'd told herself he'd made his choice. She had a boy to raise, and she couldn't keep bleeding into a mail slot. She did not know that her father bought her childhood candy every week and lined the bags up on his counter like votive candles. She did not know he was climbing 6 flights alone at 78. She did not know a young man had started carrying his groceries. She didn't know any of it until the hospital called, because Stanley Vogel had never taken her name off the emergency contact line. In 22 years, not once, which was the only letter he ever sent her, and he sent it without knowing. And it was the one that finally got through. The winter went on the way winters do. Isaac and Stanley climbed their 6 flights every Saturday. They talked more, as the weeks stacked up. Not about anything large. The old man had opinions about weather, about the landlord, about how they didn't make canned soup like they used to. Isaac learned he'd been a machinist 40 years, that his hands had made parts for engines Isaac would never see. Stanley learned the boy worked nights and had come from somewhere north and didn't say much about it, and he respected that, because Stanley Vogel had never in his life said much about anything that mattered. Once, on the third landing, Stanley had to stop longer than usual, one hand flat on the wall, and Isaac stood with him, and didn't hover, and didn't ask. And after a minute, Stanley said, "Getting harder, the stairs." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you stop on 3 now. You used to make it to 4. Stanley looked at him sharply, caught out, and then, rarest of things, almost smiled. "You keep track." "I keep track of the stairs, not you." Isaac shifted the bag. "The stairs I'm allowed to notice." And Stanley Vogel laughed. Actually laughed. A short, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. And they went up the rest of the way, and neither of them said the boy's name or the old man's name, because they still didn't know them. And by now, the not knowing had become its own kind of gift. A thing with no history in it, no debt, no 22 years of anything. Just a bag, and 6 floors, and a Saturday. It was the warmest thing in either of their lives. And it was about to break. One Saturday in late February, Stanley wasn't in the lobby. Isaac waited. He checked his mail twice, slowly. 7 o'clock came and went, then 7:15, then 7:30, and the old man did not come through the door with his sack. And Isaac stood in the cold lobby with a feeling starting low in his stomach that he knew too well, the feeling of a held breath, the feeling of a Tuesday. He went up. 6 flights, fast, taking them 2 at a time the way he never did with Stanley. He knocked on 6B. Nothing. He knocked again, said, "It's me," from downstairs, which was as much of an identity as he had, and there was no answer, only the dinner smell of the hallway and the 3 locks holding. Mrs. Doyle, from 5D, opened her door at the noise. She was 74 and knew everything that happened in the building, and she looked at Isaac with a face that told him before she said it. "You're the young man," she said, "the one who carries his groceries." "Where is he?" "Ambulance came Thursday night. I heard it on the stairs. He went down on the 3rd landing, I think. They took him." She shook her head. "It's the heart, most likely, at that age. Or a stroke. I don't know which." "Which hospital?" "I don't know, dear. St. Anne's, maybe?" "They usually go to St. Anne's." Isaac was already moving. They wouldn't tell him anything. He stood at the front desk of St. Anne's at 9 o'clock at night, and a tired woman behind the glass asked him the question that ended everything. "Are you family?" "No. I'm his neighbor. I carry his groceries. I'm sorry, sir. We can only release information to family. I just need to know if he's alive." "I understand. I really do. But I can't tell you anything unless you're family or on his contact list. What's the patient's name?" And there it was, the wall, coming down exactly where he'd built it himself. "I don't," Isaac heard his own voice go strange. "I don't know his name." The woman's face was not unkind. That was the worst of it. "You don't know his name?" He never asked mine. I never asked his. It sounded insane. Said out loud at a hospital desk. 6 months of Saturdays, and he could not produce the one word that would let him through the door. He's about 78, thin, 6th floor of the walk-up on Marden Street. He buys orange candy he never eats. He was a machinist. He stops on the 3rd landing now because he can't make 4 anymore. His voice cracked all the way through. "Please, he's the only... I don't have anybody either. He's the only person I..." "Sir," gently, "without a name, there's nothing I can do." Isaac walked out into the February cold and stood on the sidewalk and understood that he had lost him. Just like the last one. Suddenly, on an ordinary week, a man gone up a set of stairs Isaac wasn't there to help with. Except this time, it was worse. Because this time, Isaac didn't even have a name to say. Didn't have a grave to visit, didn't have anything at all. Because he had loved a man for a whole winter and been too frightened of losing him to ever once ask who he was. The thing he'd thought was keeping them safe had been the thing that left him standing alone on a sidewalk with nothing. Helen Dwyer got the call from St. Anne's on Thursday night, and she sat down on her kitchen floor with the phone still in her hand. Emergency contact for Stanley Vogel. She hadn't heard the 2 words. Stanley Vogel said by a stranger in so long that for a second she didn't understand they meant her father. He'd had a stroke. He was alive. He was asking, the nurse said. Well, he wasn't quite able to ask for much of anything right now, but his records listed her. And was she able to come? His records listed her. After 22 years of returned letters and a door that never opened, her name had been sitting there the whole time on the one line he'd never crossed out. She didn't know what to do with that. She still didn't, driving the 40 minutes at 11 at night, with Ollie asleep in the back seat because there was no one to leave him with, gripping the wheel, rehearsing things she'd given up rehearsing years ago. She had promised herself she was done. She had built a life on being done. And here she was, doing the drive again, because it turned out done was a thing you could tell yourself, but not quite become. Ollie woke up as they pulled into the hospital lot. He was 8 and rumpled and full of the terrible clarity of children. "Are we visiting the grandpa?" he asked. "The one in your wallet?" "Yes, he's sick." "Is he the one you cry about?" Helen sat very still in the parked car. "Sometimes," she said. "Yes." "Why do you cry about him if he's mean?" "He's not—" She stopped. She'd never told Ollie he was mean. Kids just know the shape of a thing. "It's complicated. Grown-ups make things complicated. Come on, hold my hand in the parking lot." Stanley Vogel was smaller in the hospital bed than he'd been in 22 years of Helen's imagining him. The stroke had taken the right side of him. His hand curled on the blanket, his mouth pulled down at one corner, his speech, when it came, slow and effortful and slurred. But his eyes were his eyes, and they found her in the doorway, and Helen watched her father see her for the first time in 2 decades, and watched his ruined face try to do something it had forgotten how to do. "Hell," he managed, and couldn't finish it, and his eyes filled. She didn't go to him right away. She wanted to, but she'd learned, the hard way over years, not to run at that door, and something in her held at the threshold. 22 years of held at the threshold. "Hi, Dad," she said. There was a small silence with a lifetime in it. Then Ollie, who had none of his mother's history and all of his own certainty, walked right up to the side of the bed and looked at the old man with frank interest. "Are you my grandpa?" Ollie asked. Stanley turned his head, looked at the boy. This boy he had never met, 8 years old with... anyone could see it. His grandmother's coloring, Iris's coloring, right there at his bedside. "Yes," Stanley got out, slow, wrecked. "I'm your grandpa." "Mom keeps your picture in her wallet," Ollie informed him. "It's really old. You have more hair in it." And Stanley Vogel laughed, the same rusty hinge Isaac had once startled out of him. Except this time, it turned, halfway, into something that shook his whole diminished body, and Helen crossed the room at last. Because you can hold at a threshold for 22 years, but not while your father is coming apart in front of your child. And she took his good hand, and that was the first thing. It was only the first thing. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was going to be much harder, and take much longer, and cost them both. But it was the first thing, and after 22 years, the first thing is not nothing. It was Mrs. Doyle who told Helen about the young man. Helen had come back to the apartment 2 days later to gather some of her father's things. Clean clothes, his glasses, the mail. She was standing in 6B, in the small, clean spare life of him, taking in the single armchair and the wall of photographs. She was in them, she realized. He'd kept every photograph of her. Her whole childhood was on that wall. The family that had ended was all still hanging there. When Mrs. Doyle knocked and came in and told her, "You should know," Mrs. Doyle said. "There's a young man, 2nd floor. He's been carrying your father's groceries up those stairs all winter, every Saturday, since around Christmas." "Who is he?" "Nobody knows, dear. That's the strange part. Nobody knows his name, and I don't think your father did either. They'd just go up the stairs together." Mrs. Doyle shook her head, wondering. "He came up here Saturday looking for Stanley, when the ambulance had already... well, he looked like the floor had gone out from under him. Ran off to find the hospital. I don't think he ever did." "What's his name?" Helen asked. "That's the thing, dear. I asked him once. He just said, 'I'm the one who carries the bags.' Like that was a whole name." Mrs. Doyle shook her head. "Your father never told him either. 2 lonely men and not one name between them. Why would they never ask? Some people, once they've lost enough, they stop reaching for the next thing they could lose." Mrs. Doyle looked at her, not unkindly. "I expect you know a little about that yourself." Helen looked at the counter then, really looked, and saw the row of unopened candy bags, 7 of them. Orange marshmallow, the children's kind, the kind she had loved when she was a girl, and eaten nothing else and been scolded for it by a mother who was in every photograph on that wall. She crossed the kitchen. She picked one up. It was that year's, fresh, unopened. Behind it, in the cupboard she opened next, were more. Dozens, years of them. The old ones stiff and faded, going back and back. He'd bought her candy every week, for 22 years, and never opened one. and never told her, and never let her in the door to see. Helen Dwyer sat down at her father's small table, in her father's small apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had been too proud and too ashamed to ever once say her name. And she cried the way you cry when you finally understand that the door you stopped knocking on had a man behind it the whole time, holding your childhood candy, waiting for a way back he couldn't make himself take. Then she wiped her face, and she went to find the young man from the second floor, because he had carried her father up 6 flights all winter, and someone in this story was finally going to know his name. Isaac had stopped going down to the lobby on Saturdays. There was no reason to now. He'd spent a week calling hospitals and being told the same thing at each. Are you family? What's the patient's name? And getting nowhere. And he'd finally stopped, because there is only so many times you can say, I don't know his name, before it starts to sound like exactly what it is, which is a confession. So when the knock came on 2C on a Sunday evening, he almost didn't answer it. Nobody knocked on his door. He didn't know anyone. That was the whole design. The woman standing in the hall was maybe 50, with a tired face and red-rimmed eyes, and a boy of about 8, half hidden behind her leg. Are you the one who carried the groceries? She said. 6th floor. The old man? Isaac's heart did something painful. Is he alive? And the woman's face crumpled a little at that, at the is he alive from a stranger, and she said, he's alive. He had a stroke. He's at St. Anne's. It's bad, but he's alive. Isaac had to put a hand on the doorframe. I couldn't find out, he said. I went to the hospital. They wouldn't tell me anything. The old shame. I didn't know his name. 6 months and I never asked his name. I know. The woman's voice was gentle and wrecked. He never asked yours either. Mrs. Doyle told me. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. I'm Helen. I'm his daughter. This is Ollie. A pause. And I came here to ask you something I should have been able to ask years ago, which is, what's his name to you? Who was he to you, that you'd carry him up 6 floors all winter and not want anything for it? Isaac looked at her. At the boy. At the hallway. He wasn't anybody to me, Isaac said. That was the thing. He was a stranger. I didn't know one true fact about him. His voice went rough. He just reminded me of somebody I didn't get to carry when I had the chance, so I carried him instead. That's all it was. It wasn't even really about him. It was... He stopped because it was suddenly, finally, the truth. It was the only way I had left to say sorry to somebody who's already gone. Helen Dwyer looked at this young man she'd never met, who had loved her father purely because he couldn't love his own grandfather anymore. And she understood something about her own 22 years, standing in that hallway, that she would spend a long time turning over. Come to the hospital, she said. Please, he should get to know your name, and you should get to know his. I think you've both earned that much. Isaac didn't say much on the drive. Ollie fell asleep again in the back seat. At a red light, Helen glanced over. You're scared to see him, she said. I spent a week sure he was dead, and that it was my fault for never knowing his name. It wasn't your fault. I could have asked. Any Saturday? I just didn't. Neither did he. Helen watched the light. You want to know something? I think that's why it worked, you two. No names, no history. Just the stairs and the bag. And you've got the opposite. We've got nothing but names and history. Look how well we did with it. The light changed, and she drove. 22 years. You're here now. We're in a car at midnight driving to a hospital, Helen said. That's not okay. That's just not too late. Turns out those are very different things. Stanley was awake when they came in. He saw Isaac in the doorway, and his whole ruined face changed. Helen saw it change, saw her father's eyes fill at the sight of the boy the way they'd filled at the sight of her, and she understood that in the empty room of her father's last years, this stranger had been something enormous. Isaac came to the side of the bed. For a moment, neither of them could speak. Then Isaac said, thick, You missed a Saturday. Stanley worked at it. Elevator's still broken. Slow, slurred, but unmistakably a joke, the old joke, and Isaac laughed, and it came out half a sob. Yeah, Isaac said, it's still broken. Stanley lifted his good hand a few inches off the blanket, which was as far as it went now, and Isaac took it. Stanley started, and stopped, and gathered himself. And the whole room waited, while a man who'd said almost nothing that mattered his entire life fought his own wrecked mouth to say one thing. I never asked. Your name. You didn't need it. I'm asking now. Isaac. He had to force it past the thing in his throat. Isaac Foley, Stanley Vogel nodded slowly, holding the name like it was one of the oranges, something round and real you could carry. Isaac, he said, I'm Stanley. A breath. Stanley Vogel. Stanley, Isaac repeated. And it was the strangest thing. How much it mattered, how a word he'd done 6 months of Saturdays without turned out to weigh so much once it was finally in his hands. It's good to meet you, Stanley. Officially. 6 months, Stanley said, the corner of his mouth that still worked pulling up. Late. Better late, Isaac said. Then the elevator. Stanley's eyes moved to Helen, standing at the foot of the bed. Then back to Isaac. You two know each other? We do now, Helen said. He carried you all winter, Dad. Up your 6 floors, every Saturday. I know what he did, Stanley's voice cracked on it. You think I didn't count every step? You never said a word to him. Didn't have the words. Stanley looked at the boy. Turns out, you don't need them to climb a stair with somebody. The hard part came after, the way it always does. Because a name is easy, in the end, and forgiveness is not. And there was still 22 years between Stanley and Helen that no hospital bed reunion was going to wave away. There was a week and then another, where Helen came every day and sat with him, and the two of them circled the thing without touching it, talking about Ollie, about the doctors, about anything but the kitchen and the newspaper and the words he'd said over her mother's body. It was Helen who finally said it, because she'd learned by now that if you wait for Stanley Vogel to open a door, you'll wait your whole life. I need to talk about Mom, she said. I've needed to for 22 years. And I don't have another 22 to wait for you to be ready. Stanley's face closed. The old reflex, the door swinging. But he was too weak now to slam it. And maybe too tired. And maybe, finally, too near the end of things to keep paying Pride's rent. You said I wasn't there, Helen said. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. You said she was asking for me, and I wasn't there. And I have carried that for 22 years, Dad. That I let my mother die alone. And it wasn't true. I'd been there the week before. There was nothing I could have done. But you put it on me, and you closed the door, and you let me believe I killed her by not being there. The room was very quiet. Ollie was in the hall with a nurse. It was just the two of them, and 22 years. Why? Helen said. I just need to know why. And Stanley Vogel, who had spent his whole life not wanting things to be anything, looked at his daughter and did the bravest thing he'd ever done, which was to stop. Because it was me, he said. It came out slow and broken, half his face not working, and it was the hardest sentence he'd ever built. She said her chest hurt. She said it twice, and I told her. His good hand shook on the blanket. I told her to sit down. She was making a fuss. I was reading the paper. I didn't want it to be anything. So I decided it wasn't. And I waited, and I read my paper while He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. By the time I called, she was gone. It was me, Helen. I was there. I was the one who was there, and I did nothing. And I have known that every day for 22 years. Helen couldn't speak. And when you came, Stanley went on, forcing it now, needing it out. I couldn't. If it was my fault, I couldn't live. I couldn't. So I made it yours. I looked at you, and I gave you the thing I couldn't carry, because you were the only person I loved enough to hate for it. His ruined face was wet. It was the worst thing I ever did. Worse than the chair. Worse than the paper. I killed your mother by waiting, and then I killed you and me, both by lying about it. And I was too much of a coward to take it back, for 22 years, because taking it back meant saying out loud that it was me. Dad, I bought your candy. He said it like it was connected, and it was. Every week, the orange kind. I don't know why. I couldn't call you, and I couldn't write you, and I couldn't say I was sorry. So I bought your candy, and I put it on the counter, and it was all I could. And there the sentence ended. Because Stanley Vogel had finally run all the way out of the pride that had cost him everything. And he put his working hand over his face, in a hospital bed, and wept for his wife and his daughter, and 22 years of a door he could have opened any day, and didn't. Helen Dwyer sat there with her own 22 years, and she did not forgive him easily, because it was not an easy thing, and she was not going to insult it by making it easy. But she got up, and she moved the chair close, and she took her father's hand down from his face and held it, and she said, "That's the first true thing you've said to me since I was 29. I know. It's going to take the long time. I know. But I'm not going anywhere." She held on. "I stopped being able to knock, Dad. 3 years ago. I want you to know that. It wasn't that I stopped loving you. It was that I couldn't survive the door anymore. I know that too. He gripped her hand with what strength the stroke had left him. I heard you. Every time. On the other side. I heard you knock, and I sat in the chair, and I heard you, and I didn't move, and God forgive me, Helen. I heard every single one. Stanley Vogel did not go home to the 6th floor. He couldn't. The stroke had seen to that. And no one was going to carry a half-paralyzed man up 6 flights for the rest of his life. And the landlord, shamed at last by a daughter who would not stop calling, fixed the elevator in April, 3 years too late for the man who'd needed it most. Instead, Helen moved him to a small apartment near her own, ground floor, no stairs at all, and she came every day. And Ollie came, and slowly, not quickly, nothing about it was quick. A family that had been dead for 22 years began the long, imperfect, real work of not being dead anymore. He never fully recovered. That's the truth. And this is not the kind of story where I'm going to lie to you about it. His speech stayed slow. His right hand stayed curled. He needed help with things a proud man hates needing help with. And he learned at 78, with his daughter's hand under his arm, to let himself be helped, which was the one lesson his whole hard life had refused to teach him. And a stroke, and a stranger, finally did. And Isaac came. That was the part nobody planned. Helen had gone to that 2nd floor door to learn a name and thank a stranger. And instead, she'd found a young man as alone in the world as her father had made himself. A boy who'd lost the one person who raised him and had no one. And it did not take Helen Dwyer long to understand that the universe had handed her something. You should come Sundays, she told Isaac. For dinner. Ollie asks about you. And Dad, she smiled. Dad pretends he doesn't, but he sits by the window on Sundays. I don't want to intrude. You've got your family back. You don't need... Isaac? Helen looked at him the way his grandmother might have, if he'd had one. You carried my father up 6 flights of stairs all winter and asked for nothing, and didn't even take his name. You don't get to tell me you're an intrusion. Come to dinner. That's not charity. That's the bill coming due, and it's a good bill, and you're going to pay it by sitting at my table and eating too much and letting an old man be glad you exist. Sundays. Don't argue. Isaac came Sundays. The first one was awkward, the way first ones are. Ollie was not awkward because 8-year-olds aren't. Are you the stairs guy? Ollie asked, before Isaac had his coat off. I guess I'm the stairs guy. Grandpa says you never dropped the eggs one time, all winter. That's true, not one egg. That's really good. Ollie considered him with new respect. I drop stuff all the time. You've got smaller hands. You'll grow into them. From the armchair by the window, slow and dry, Stanley said, Boy asks more questions than a customs agent. He gets it from you, Helen said, setting the table. You just stopped answering yours 20 years ago. There was a beat where that could have gone wrong. Then Stanley's working mouth pulled up at the corner. Fair, he said. That's fair. Grandpa, is Isaac staying for dinner? Ollie asked. Ask him. Are you staying for dinner? Isaac looked at the small, crowded table, the mismatched chairs, the noise of a family that had decided to be one again. Yeah, he said, and had to clear his throat. Yeah, I'm staying. Good. You can sit by me, Ollie decided. I'll show you which candy's the best one. They're all the same candy, Ollie. No, they're not. The dark orange ones are better. Everybody knows that. Everybody except me, apparently. That's okay. You'll learn. He still carries groceries. The elevator works now, on Martin Street, but Stanley doesn't live there anymore. And where Stanley lives now, there are no stairs at all. So on Sundays, Isaac brings the bags in from Helen's car and sets them on the counter, and among them, always, because some habits are load-bearing, there's a bright bag of orange marshmallow candy, the children's kind, with a cartoon on the front. The difference is they open it now. Ollie eats most of it. Stanley has one or two, slow, his good hand working the wrapper, and Helen has one. And every single time she does, something passes between her and her father that doesn't need a word. 22 years of unopened bags finally getting opened one Sunday at a time. Isaac has a photograph on his own wall now, in the single room on the 2nd floor he never moved out of. It's Stanley. Helen took it, at the table. Stanley caught mid-laugh at something Ollie said, the rusty hinge of him wide open. Isaac put it next to the only other photograph he owns, which is his grandfather. And some nights, he looks at the 2 old men side by side and understands that he did, in the end, get to carry one of them up the stairs. Not the one he wanted, but the world doesn't always let you pay the person you owe. Sometimes, it just lets you pay. He never told Stanley the whole of it. The grandfather, the finding him, the 14 months, the reason a stranger's slow climb had meant so much. He didn't have to. One Sunday, Stanley just looked at him across the table, slow and knowing, and said, "You were carrying somebody else all that winter, weren't you?" And Isaac said, "Yeah." And Stanley nodded and reached over with his good hand and patted Isaac's arm once, the way you'd steady something, and said, "Good. Somebody should get carried. Doesn't much matter whose name's on it." Ollie is 9 now, and he asked his mother once why his grandpa and Isaac took so long to be friends when they liked each other the whole time. "Because they never asked each other's names," Helen said, "for a whole winter. Isn't that strange? Why didn't they just ask?" "I think they were both a little scared. Sometimes, when you don't know somebody's name, it's easier. There's nothing to lose yet." Ollie thought about this the way he thought about everything, with his whole face, and then he said the thing that his mother wrote down that night so she wouldn't forget it, the thing that was truer than he knew. "But you don't need a name to help somebody up the stairs." "No," Helen said. "You don't. You don't need a person's name to carry them." She kissed the top of his head. "But it's a nice thing to know in the end, once you've earned it. Because that's the whole of it, really. You don't need a name to carry someone through a hard winter." Isaac proved that, one Saturday at a time, 6 floors at a time, for a man he knew nothing about. The name isn't the thing that makes you show up in a cold lobby for a stranger. The name isn't the thing that makes an old man buy candy for 22 years, or a daughter drive 40 minutes at 11 at night, or a young man carry the weight of a grief he couldn't set down anywhere else up 6 flights of someone else's stairs. The name is just the last gift, the one you give when the carrying is already done and the winter is already over, and you've finally decided to stop being afraid of losing the people you've somehow, against all your careful planning, already come to love. Stanley and Isaac climbed 6 floors together, all winter, and never asked. By spring they knew, and by then it turned out the knowing was the smallest part, the last, small, good thing, set down gently on top of everything they'd already carried.